viewers, and welcome. Wherever you are, welcome to this live stream show, Skeptics in the Hub, with a fabulous guest. I'm a bit more than pleased. I'm beside myself to be able to announce that tonight we have Professor AC Grayling, who, as you know, is the first master of the new College of Humanities, a vice president of Humanist UK, a former professor of Birkbeck College. The list goes on. And of course, he's a multiple author. I have one of his books here, which he signed for me here. And we can link to his sites where you can buy his books at the end of the show. Anthony, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. It's our privilege to have you. So the plan is, as you know, because we've chatted about this before, for me to screen the views of a non-philosopher, a retired science teacher who's interested in philosophy and keen to learn about philosophy, but may be wrong. But, you know, if I'm wrong about some of these slides, that I won't be insulted, because I understand that's how we learn. We learn by being wrong. So I'm prepared to be wrong. Shall I show the first the
Yes,
slide? Yep. Okay, here we go. Right, you can see that?
Yes, indeed.
Good. I just get my laptop. It's gone to sleep. No, it won't open. Right. Okay. So now the reason for this is because I get involved in discussion with a lot of people who subscribe to a religion. This is because my current role is publications director of Atheist Alliance International. So it's my job, really. And I don't think of myself as an atheist so much as a science teacher. I'm still teaching science. That's my mission. But many of these believers use philosophical arguments to support their beliefs. And I think that their understanding of philosophy isn't quite right. But as I said, I'm not qualified in philosophy, and nevertheless, I'm an admirer of it. So let's see how you respond to some of my slides. That's not contentious, is it?
No, and I would say that almost any form of inquiry involves thinking, disciplined, rational, organized thinking. So philosophy is not alone in that.
No, indeed. And we want thinking, we want thought, particularly logical thought, because that's the best sort of thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
Good. Well, we're on the same page at the start. Okay. Now, I would say that thought can lead to argument. What are they called? Syllogisms and things like that. And my view is that you need argument to support a proposition that is dubious. Its decision hasn't been made yet. The jury is out, as it were. Whereas evidence is something that supports propositions that have been established. Now, that's because I want to distinguish between these two nouns, and that may not be such a straightforward dichotomy, but that's the position I would like things to be in.
Okay, well, let me say first that the word argument is ambiguous, as between a quarrel, you know, when people are disagreeing with one another and taking opposed views and getting a bit heated and so forth. So argument in that sense, which is not the sense that we're talking about. We're talking about a structure of premises, yes, from which a conclusion is drawn. In the case of a deductive argument, the conclusion is simply a rearrangement of the information in the premises. There is never any factual novelty in a deduction just a rearrangement. There can be plenty of psychological novelty in a deduction, because you may not realize, if you put the information together in a certain way, what the conclusion is. I mean, every detective story is the story of the detective resorting and resorting the information in the premises until the conclusion falls out. An inductive argument, on the other hand, goes beyond what's in the premises. So just generally speaking, an argument is a structure of premises and conclusion. And when you have, in logic, when we're teaching logic, we distinguish between the formal properties of the argument and whether or not the argument is sound. So it's a formal property of an argument whether or not it's valid as to its form. And if you have a valid form of argument and you have true premises, that is, if you have good evidence in the premises, then you are guaranteed a true conclusion. So soundness is something which is additional. I'll give you an example. Here is an obviously valid and sound argument. So all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. You can see the conclusion, just a rearrangement, and it's valid and fine. Here's another argument which is valid, but you can judge whether it's sound. Nothing is brighter than the sun. A candle is brighter than nothing. Therefore, a candle is brighter than the sun.
Yes.
Now there you can see it's valid as to its form, but it's unsound, because in the premises, a fallacy has been committed. It's called the fallacy of equivocation, because the word nothing in the two premises has different senses.
Yes. That reminds me of an old television advert. There was a commercial for, I think it was Anodin, and the commercial said, "Nothing acts faster than Anodin." So the deduction was, take nothing.
Exactly.
So look, this is my attempt to separate argument from evidence. And there's a lot of contentious statements in there. I think you will pull that apart.
Right. So I think that what you've got at work here under your argument column, if you were to substitute for the word argument the word hypothesis or speculation, but so let's say hypothesis, because you're quite right, an hypothesis or a speculation would be something which you might come up with, in the brain. You might think about it, and you might suggest some things that would support your hypothesis or give you some reason for thinking that it's not false. So these are the premises that are awaiting falsification. But then, of course, you do have to be clear. So you have to, clarify the component ideas in the premises, and you need to obviously make observations to see whether or not they will stand up. On the right-hand side, your right-hand column there, so I'm just having a quick look at it. The assumption that lies behind the way you've structured that is that something has presented itself to you, as it were, from without. So, something which counts as objective or as sort of visibly established out there, which is in its way, from the point of view of its degree of persuasiveness, it's quite coercive because it's an external fact. I think that's the idea that you've got at work there.
Yeah.
What a skeptic might say about this approach to argument and evidence is that the idea that the external reality can impose itself on us in a way which is indisputable, and we simply just have to accept the fact of it, a bit like running into a brick wall and finding that you can't pass through it. That's been challenged in the philosophy of science by those who say that we always bring to our observations a theoretical apparatus. That we never just see, we always see as. It's always highly interpretative already. And that in fact what happens in the process of inquiry is that we are supposing things to be a certain way, and we need to check. And therefore, we've got to test, and we've got to challenge ourselves, and we've got to look for falsifying evidence to see whether what we're thinking might be wrong. And it's by that means that we uncover what really does count as evidence. And that's quite a tricky thing in a way, because there is a paradox. It's called the paradox of the ravens, which applies to the question of evidence. It's quite interesting. I mean, if I say to you, all ravens are black,
Mm-hmm.
and you say, fine, then I say, well, that entails, because that's logically equivalent to saying that anything which isn't black is not a raven. So if I can point at anything that is both not black and not a raven, then that confirms my hypothesis that all ravens are black. So I point at my shirt and say, this is white and it's not a raven. So that confirms that all ravens are black. Obviously it seems not to, but logically speaking, it does. So that's what's called the paradox of the ravens.
So that's one of the occasions when logic seems to fall down. But I'd like to mention Becquerel, who discovered radiation by discovering a photographic slide in a drawer in which he put a piece of uranium-containing rock, and some days later he pulled the slide out, thought it was not exposed, but developed it anyway, and found the shape of the radiating rock.
Mm.
Now, in that case, what preconception was he bringing? He had a puzzle. He didn't know what might have caused this mysterious development of slides. So what was he bringing to that?
Okay, well, it's a great story, isn't it? Because the rock took a selfie while nobody was looking and photographed itself, which is wonderful. Now you could imagine, if you remember Popper, and his distinction between what he called the psychology of discovery and the logic of discovery. So the psychology of the discovery is that it might be pure accident, as in the case of Becquerel, or you might dream that you see a snake eating its own tail, and this gives you an idea about molecular structure, and so on and so on. So,
wasn't it?
That's correct.
Yes.
So the idea of how you might stumble across an idea is one thing. How you confirm it, how you look for an explanation that will stand up in the light of the evidence is another thing. So in the case of Becquerel, he could have thought that there were lots of hypotheses. Somebody could have snuck into his study and done something strange, or a ghost might have done it, or he could just be had too much beer, or there are lots of different hypotheses. But the one that looked most interesting to explore, and which subsequently, of course, yielded to test, was that the rock was radioactive, and that's what had caused the image to appear. Right.
So he brought options to the table, I suppose.
Yes, because unless you can exclude, some sort of possible explanations, you're not going to be able to narrow down to the things that you could really identify and test.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll agree about this, won't we? That science constructs models and then tests them. Mm-hmm. And this is a saying that a couple of weeks ago I had Professor Lee Cronin from Glasgow University on this show, and he's researching the origin of life. Mm-hmm. And he said something which resonated with me. He said, belief begins where falsification ends. And I've had my own version of that for some time, which I quoted back at him. And he said, whoa, my version is beliefs are opinions about the unknown.
Well, firstly, I must confess to you that the line there, belief begins where falsification ends. Insofar as I can attach content to it, you might perhaps be able to explain a bit more about what he meant when he said that. But firstly, we notice that belief is a psychological state. You can
Yeah.
believe things that are true. You can believe things that are false. You can believe things that are absolutely absurd.
Yes.
So belief is just a psychological state. Knowledge is a relationship between a state of belief and something independent of it, something which has to be true if it's going to be knowledge and not just belief. Now, there are very, very few cases where we can have complete verification of something that we believe. And therefore, most of what we believe, even, about the Higgs boson and all sorts of things that are found in science, there tend to be things to which we attach a very high probability.
Yeah.
This takes us back to your earlier slide where you talked about rationality, because that's a very interesting concept and it applies here to the question of belief. If you think of the word rational, first part of the word is ratio, which means proportion.
Yeah.
A belief is rational to the degree in which it is proportional to the evidence that you have for it. So the higher the more proportioned it is to the evidence you have, the more supported the belief is, and vice versa, of course, for a weak belief. So I think perhaps an alternative thing to say is that belief is what you have until it is challenged or tested,
Right.
And belief has no kind of degree of probability until you've looked for the evidence and you've thought about what kinds of reasons you might bring in its favor or against it.
Yes. So until rather than begins.
Yes.
Interesting. I'm writing that down.
Because of course, falsification, in Popper's philosophy of science, he says that if you have an hypothesis, you should try to find out whether you can show it to be false. So try to falsify it.
Yes, it must be investigable.
Yes, and anything which isn't investigable, an hypothesis which is consistent with any evidence or no evidence, is empty. This is the problem that, this is one reason why some of us are atheists, because the hypothesis that there is a deity or there are deities can be consistent with absolutely anything and everything, including natural evil and childhood cancers and, all sorts of awful things. So nothing whatever seems to count as what would disconfirm the hypothesis. Popper said, a theory is only properly scientific if you can say what would show that it's wrong.
Yes. Yes. Well, I would prefer not to say empty, but to say you revert to the default position, which is skepticism.
There is, okay, so let's go back to our point about rationality, because what you've just said there is, if we slightly rephrased it, would be what an agnostic would say, about the hypothesis that there is a deity. And the point about that is that, I've often said that the arguments for and against the existence of gods and goddesses are just the same as the arguments for and against the existence of fairies. Now,
yes.
People think I'm being flippant, but I'm not at all, because, of course, for a very, very long time, there was quite, confirmed belief in fairies. So they curdled the milk and they pinched your shoelaces and they even pinched you when you weren't looking and so forth. So you can test this by saying, how rational is it to believe that there are fairies in your garden? How rational? What evidence do you have to proportion to that belief? And the answer is very, very, very little. And then exactly the same thing applies with belief in divinities or supernatural agencies of some kind. And that is the point. If you leave aside the question of knowledge and truth, and you just look at the question of rational belief, and you say what would count as supporting a belief, and what would be such that its absence would give you a very low confidence in the belief, and then that's where you see the real role of falsification and verification is really about strength of credibility.
Well, if we consider belief to be a scale, then the needle can move from one pole to the other. But surely in everyday life, there's a position on that scale not at the extreme end, because of course absoluteness is not available, which is one of my other contentions we're coming on to, but it's somewhere highly probable, and in everyday life that's what we consider to be true. But that's another slide I'm going to show you in a minute.
Okay, but mind you, you've put your finger on something important there, which is that the really significant thing here is how much credence, how much, where on the probability scale we're prepared to put the needle with respect to some belief. Yeah.
Yes. And that's why I would rather use belief. I mean, I know this isn't what the dictionary says, but in my ideal world, if you gave me a magic wand, I would change the meaning of the word belief and apply it only to things that are really dubious. And those things which have been repeatedly shown to be correct, like evolution, for example, I would say they don't require belief. They've gone beyond the need for belief.
Mm. Well, again, there's a good point in what you're saying there, because if somebody said, I believe in evolution, the implication is that it's something which is intrinsically doubtful and it's still open for debate. And what if some other form of word said that I accept the powerfully supported scientific theory of evolution, something like that. I agree with you, but we've got to live with the realities of the language. Unfortunately,
we can only live in the world we're in. But this is the trouble with the word belief. It has two meanings. It can mean merely accepting something, which is really solid and concrete, like, if I jump out of this window, I will fall. Or it can mean I believe in fairies. There's a big range of, it's perfect for equivocation. So this is my illustration of what the situation we're in today. We've got a mountain of stuff that science has proven. No, I'm not going to use the word proof. That is very evidential. And then at the point of this mountain, we've got a frontier where we don't know. And that's where people like Brian Cox are working and trying to answer our questions. They are our curious people trying to solve the mysteries that are currently unsolved.
Well, I think you are entitled to use the word proof. The reason why we feel leery about doing so is because, of course, again, the word proof is ambiguous. The word proof in the formal context of mathematics and logic means that the conclusion is guaranteed by the evidence in the form. Okay, so that's what we mean in mathematical proof. But in the everyday and scientific and colloquial sense of the word proof, it means something different. Proof means test. So, if you go to a steel foundry, you will see that if they're casting steel rods, they will take every 100th rod and they will load it to see how much loading it will take before it fractures. That is called proving the rod, testing it. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. That's the test of the pudding. The exception that proves the rule, the exception that proves, that tests the rule to show how far the rule applies or not. Okay, so in that case, the foundations of science, the theories and findings in science which we confidently premise in our further investigations and further they have been proved and proved and proved. That is, they've been tested and tested, which is why we repose confidence in them. But a very interesting thing, and this is the wonderful thing about science, the thing I love about the scientific method, is that even the most solid foundations are defeasible. That is, that if new evidence came along, better arguments or new experiments, and showed us that we had to revise them, modify them, or give them up, then we would do it. That's the marvelous thing about it. Whereas dogma and faith is characterized by a refusal to let anything count against them.
Yes, they won't accept criticism, but science is always provisional. We don't shut the door on anything. And as you say, that's one of the wonderful things about it. So this is another of my contentions. What do you think of that? Because I contend that so far in our examination of the natural realm, we haven't found anything, we haven't got observations of anything that's absolute. We can speculate that there's an absolute speed for light, and we can speculate that there is an absolute zero for temperature, but we haven't actually managed to observe either of those. We've got close, but we haven't actually managed to observe either of those. So if you discount absoluteness, then truth becomes entirely relative.
Well, okay, so this is an interesting and complex one. Let me take a couple of steps back so that I can have a run at this, okay?
Okay.
And ask you to think about the following three words: true, beautiful, good. Now, each of those words has a multiplicity of meanings and of applications in different domains. Think of the word beautiful. If you think of a beautiful face, a beautiful sunset, a beautiful painting, a beautiful piece of music, it applies to lots of very, very different things. And what counts as making it true that something is beautiful will depend upon which area you're thinking in, whether it's art or nature and so forth. Now, if you think about our saying such and such is true, so let's just take the letter P to stand for a proposition, okay? P is true. Well, in what domain of discussion, of discourse, inquiry, does P come from? Does P come from, let us say, arithmetic? Well, what makes P is true in arithmetic are the rules that govern our use of the numbers and operations and so forth.
Yes.
What makes P is true in morality? For example, it's wrong to tell a lie or something.
Yeah.
What makes it true if we're talking about there are trees in the forest, in the case of nature? Do you see? In other words, the concept of truth, the very word true is like a placeholder. It's like an empty box, and you have to look at the more specific thing that you will put into the box in place of the word true, because it's so general. So that's just one remark to make. Another remark to make is that, of course, we treat truth as a great value. We think that the truth is always more valuable than falsehood, even though very, very occasionally a falsehood can be a good thing. You know, the classic case is where somebody says, does my bum look big in this? And you say, no, and you're not telling the truth, but it keeps the peace. Okay, so the kind of case where sometimes truth can get in the way. And indeed, of course, sometimes telling the truth can cause harm. So
there's a joke about that. I don't know whether you've heard this. The wife says, does my bum look big in this? And husband says, step back a bit so I can get it all in.
Oh dear, that would be quite the wrong way to go. Okay. So we could think of truth as this great value which we're aiming for. It is a kind of ideal of inquiry. We're struggling to get there. We're trying to get as close to it as we can. We try to converge on the truth. And so the concept of truth is the sort of idealization which invites us to try to get as close as we possibly can to it. So it has a methodological use in that sense. So you're beginning to see now that the concept of truth is very multiple, has these different uses. And a statement like the one that you've got on the screen there, that truth is not absolutely universal, gives immediately, in a way, too much to the relativist who wants to say, well, what you value, what you think is true, and what's important to you is not so for me. So I'm going to act differently or think differently. And there's nothing, and since truth is not absolute or universal, nothing can count as adjudicating between us.
Yeah.
You know, and relativism, of course, creates a lot of problems. And what we need to try to do is to maximize agreement by hoping that there is such a thing as the truth of the matter to which we can, on which we can converge.
Yes, we would love there to be absolute truth. But the trouble is we've got so many words in the field of philosophy, it seems, that are multiple meanings. We need a better dictionary.
Well, you put your finger on why there is philosophy. You know, your desire is like Leibniz's desire. Leibniz said, if only we could construct a universal calculus in which every word has an absolutely fixed meaning, and we had a structure of argumentation, and then we could just solve all our problems, all our philosophical problems. But the fact that words like truth and beauty and goodness and so forth have lots of different meanings is also very useful. I'll give you a very trivial example of how. Supposing I rush into your bedroom at 2 o'clock in the morning and I say fire, and you lie there thinking, my word, that's a very, very ambiguous word there, because it could mean the flame on the end of a match, or it could mean the universal conference. Well, by the time you've chosen which, where on the scale of things the meaning lies, you could be in trouble. So vagueness in language is sometimes a very useful thing. And to communicate, we sometimes do need to use expressions like is true, is beautiful, is good, which do the right kind of job, even though if you needed to dig down more deeply. So, for example, is true in arithmetic could mean is provable in the proof system of arithmetic.
I'm coming on to maths in a minute.
Is true in the moral context could mean something like promotes value or is better than the alternative. Is true in the natural world case could mean is verifiable by observation. So in other words, it's a kind of dummy, could be regarded as a kind of dummy predicate into which you have to put more precise ones dependent upon the domain of discourse.
Yes, indeed. So I like to think in terms of two realms. Now, I know I'm not a dualist, so I have a conceptual realm, which is inside of craniums, and a natural realm, which is outside of craniums. That gives me a basis for working forward in my worldview. So in the conceptual realm, that's where thinking resides. And I would say, I know you've been using the word conclusion for the outcome of your logical reasoning, but I would prefer to use the word inference, and I would reserve the word conclusion for a correspondence between an inference and the observations in the natural realm.
Well, okay, so just on that last point, of course, you're entitled to attach a meaning and to want to restrict the meaning of something. Generally speaking, in logic, the word inference denotes a process of drawing a conclusion from premises, inferring it. So we say that a given conclusion is an inference from these premises. But as I say, you're entitled to give that more precise meaning to it of your own. This distinction between the conceptual realm and the natural realm is a good distinction. And the interesting thing about it is that the conceptual realm, that is the realm of our thought and of our experience, given that what happens inside the cranium is relational. That is, my mind is the result of my brain's interaction with other brains and the natural environment.
Yeah.
I couldn't if I were just, completely sealed off, like sort of Helen Keller, who had never had any help from anybody, would never have had any thoughts, really. So mental activity is essentially relational activity.
Yeah.
But the conceptual realm, which is created by these relations with other minds, other brains, the world around me, is a much bigger, more important, more richly textured thing than the natural realm.
Yes.
The universe we mainly occupy is the social universe.
Yes, there's no limit to what we can conceive of. And I've got another slide of that somewhere too. I don't know. This is me saying how I would like it to work.
Yeah, I can see where you're getting at. The theme which is running through your slides here is this idea of what we might alternatively put by saying hypothesizing, supposing, speculating, wondering, and this is coming from us, so to speak. So we are making things up, but and some of it happens to match up with what's out there, and a lot of it doesn't. But what's coming at us from the outside world is objectivity, fact, reality, and it's the final test. So I see the theme which is emerging here, and on the whole, of course, it's right. I mean, what we want is always to discipline and guide and check the things that we think and hypothesize by the way our testing of the world results.
Yes. You can see, I apologize for the use of the word Trump in this little phrase, but you can see that I would often get accused of scientism because of my attitude.
No, but I mean, the point is that ultimately the empirical test, which is what making observations in the laboratory or in life comes down to, that if we substituted for the word thought, we substituted speculation or hypothesis or a will to believe something, then of course, the facts as we collect them through observation must trump those things. I mean, again, if I say, well, I would love to be able to fly, or I think I can fly, or when I've had my couple of glasses of wine, I think I am flying or something. Well, actual observation would pretty soon correct me, wouldn't it?
Yes,
so in that sense, all right, yeah.
Yes, indeed. So this is all about materialism, really, isn't it? It's because we think that there is a reality that's hard, and that the prospect of there being a supernatural realm or a spiritual realm is extremely improbable.
Well, you might go further and say irrational, because it's such a low probability that to give it a degree of credence, to premise your actions on it, to structure your life on it, would be quite literally irrational, because it's not rational to do it.
Yes, indeed. So
just before you leave the materialism thing, may I say this? You know, we human beings are the size we are because we live on a planet with this degree of gravity, etc., etc. So you see where I'm coming from in a moment. So the way that we, as it were, carve up the world so that we can handle it, you know, into bananas that we can eat and motor cars that we can drive, into what the philosopher John Austin called medium-sized dry goods. Okay, that's how we carve the world up. If we were very, very much smaller, then, you know, things of the size of molecules or atoms might be salient to us. And if we were very much larger, supposing we were the size of half the galaxy, then of course the universe would look very different again.
Yeah.
So the way the world appears to us and the way we think of it as materialists is actually a construct. I mean, as you know, your visual experience at the moment is a whole lot of electrochemical activity in the occipital region of your brain, fed forward to interpretation in the temporal parietal lobes, but it's all happening inside your skull. You're not looking out of windows at a world arrayed out there. And so what is outside your head is nothing like the way that your brain interprets and constructs it. So you know, it's the very interesting fact about us that our treating our materialism as the hard and fast, the factual, the basic, the observational, the check on our experience is kind of odd in a way when you consider that it's actually a virtual reality.
It's a representation, yes. I think it was Alice Roberts who wrote a book on why we are how we are, why we are the size we are, and it is to do with the gravity of Earth, but it's also to do with the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere and the radiation of heat from a body of such a volume and surface area.
That's right.
So this, I don't know, you're going to, please see if you spot the circular reasoning in this.
Well, that looks right to me.
Yeah.
You know, on the understanding that we've worked out for these notions, this is right, I think. Yeah.
Good. I was fearful that I've assumed materialism in order to prove it. So there you go. Materialism is reasonable. So that's non-dualism, isn't it? We don't think there's... I love it when people talk about a supernatural realm, and I want to ask them why it's super. Surely it's unnatural. That's good enough as a description of it. If they call it super, then why shouldn't we have another one and call it super duper?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, the super in supernatural just is the etymology from Latin, just means above. So,
yes.
In addition to or beside.
Yeah.
But by the way, in connection with dualism, again, like most things, the term is slightly ambiguous. You're using it in its primary sense to mean that there is matter and there isn't mind or spiritual stuff or something which exists independently of matter, and that is the correct definition of materialism. There are some materialists who are committed to a form of dualism which is known as property dualism. That is, that some material things can have additional properties. So the material brain can have properties both of weight and color and texture and so forth, but can also have properties of being able to think and remember and the like. So that's property dualism.
Yes, yes. Well, I wouldn't put a division in there. It's like saying that hardware and software are not codependent.
Right. In this slide here, now this is interesting. Descartes said, "I can conceive of a kiliagon. A kiliagon is a 1,000-sided polygon. But I cannot imagine it." Now, of course, he was using the term "imagine" to mean to form an image of it. Yes. We have generalized the idea of imagination now in an interesting way. You can imagine anything. You could imagine flying out of your window, or imagine meeting a Martian or whatever. But in order to conceive of doing any of those things, you have to be able to tell a consistent story that connects how things are with you now and that fact. So I can imagine being a multimillionaire, but in order to conceive of being one, then I have to tell a story about winning the lottery, etc. Yes. Okay.
I see. Yes.
So in what you say there, we can imagine anything, real or unreal. And so then the question of distinguishing it, of course, you're dead right. You have to try to see whether or not it matches up to how things are in reality. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So there's the Penrose triangle, which of course we can conceive but cannot make.
Yeah.
It can't exist. And here is something else that we can conceive of, which is purely fantasy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, now our Humpty Dumpty there is a case of imagining rather than conceiving, because we can't imagine an egg prancing about like that. We can't imagine a human being looking like an egg and prancing about like that, maybe. The thing about the Penrose triangle is that it only works in 2 dimensions, of course. The point about it is that you can on a 2-dimensional plane, you can construct a figure that looks as if it were 3-dimensional, it would have this very curious property. Yeah.
It's an optical illusion.
Yeah.
Right. So we've talked about proof, and I would put proof firmly in the conceptual realm because of the lack of absoluteness in the natural realm. And I would say that logic and maths depend on proof, which makes them also conceptual.
Right. Okay. So there would be people who would immediately say, this would take a little bit of unraveling. By proof, now we're talking about proof in a formal context, which is what logic and mathematics are. And yes, logic and mathematics very much depend upon proof. That is true. What I think you're getting at here is the idea that the process of proving is something that we do. It's an intellectual process. It's a mental process.
Yes.
And therefore, you are concluding, and this I don't think follows, actually. You're concluding that because proving something in logical or maths is a mental process, logic and maths themselves don't relate to anything objective.
No.
Now, as you know, that there are plenty of people, including Plato, by the way, and others, who think that mathematics is independent of our minds. Frege, for example, famously said, mathematical and logical concepts are not psychological concepts. That the truth of 1 + 1 = 2 is independent of whatever we think about it, or whether any human beings ever existed to think about it, and therefore independent of the fact that we can construct a proof to demonstrate why 1 + 1 = 2. So those are the so-called Platonists or realists about mathematics. So they would say, yes, we construct proofs in logic and mathematics, but that doesn't say that logic and maths are merely outcomes of our thinking.
Right. Yes, this is something I meet, and here's the common theistic view that maths is discovered, as depicted by my cartoon friend Sebastian.
Mm-hmm.
But I contend that maths it's fabricated. It's a language, like all languages, is very useful, but it's a human concept. Mm-hmm. And to support that, I would say that geometry, for example, relies on unreal concepts like lines that have length but no width, and points that have location but no area, and pi, for example, which is an irrational number. So I would say that the whole thing is invented. Okay.
Well, that's perfectly legitimate. It's one side of a fierce argument between those who are, as you are, constructivists, and those or anti-realists or nominalists, and those who are realists or Platonists about these matters. So this is a very familiar, long-standing dispute in the philosophy of mathematics, and you take one side of it. Yeah. By the way, it would be as well not to cite the example of idealizations in geometry, because of course we can create idealizations of anything. I mean, the fact that a line is treated as having length but no width, as existing in just one dimension, is an idealization, and we understand that it is. So that by itself doesn't show that there is no such thing as a line, or
It's a bit of a circular argument. So my contention then would be that in the natural realm, because the universe is quantized, we do have lots of ones, lots of units, but grouping them together into 7, 13, and 49 is a human construct.
Well, supposing as good materialists, you and I are also pluralists. So we don't think with Parmenides that there's only one thing in the universe. We agree that there is more than one thing. And if we're pluralists, then we're committed to the idea of the objective existence of a quantity. How we humans, so Martians and Venusians, but how we organize quantities into 7, 13, 49 would be something conventional. That's true. But the fact that there is a plurality, a quantity of things, is not something which depends upon us, on the fact that we count. That's what a realist would say about the nature of the universe.
Right. Well, there is a plurality of things right now, but according to what we think we know about the origin of the universe, it hasn't always been that way. At one stage, there was one thing, and it was this mysteriously difficult to define thing called energy. And then it condensed, to misuse a word, into matter. And at that stage, maybe pluralism began to evolve. Well, these discussions always end up at the beginning of the universe, don't they?
They do, yeah. Well, no, I agree with you. It may very well be that at the point of the Big Bang or before it or some earlier phase of the universe's history, there was one kind of thing, energy. And because of the kind of thing it wasn't separated into discrete units. That may very well be so. And that only when it had phase transitions that occurred such that things like particles began to appear, that you got a plurality of individual things. That may very, very well be true, for all I know. But it remains the fact that if there was only one kind of thing, one is still a quantity. So the argument that the realists about these matters would put is to say that it doesn't matter how many things there are in any given quantity, whether 1 or 7 or 13 or 49, but there is quantity. It is we who have come up with a conventional means for grouping it and counting it. For example, the reason why we have 60 minutes in the hour and 50 seconds in a minute, we all know this, comes from the Babylonian way of doing things. Yeah. And the reason why that is so, of course, is because if you hold up 4 fingers and then 3 sections to each finger, so you've got 12 sections on your fingers, and you can use this thumb to count them, and then you've got 5 digits on your other hand, and 5 12s are 60, so you've got a very natural counting system just on your hands.
Yes.
So that's a purely conventional way of doing things, and the decimal system is a different but purely conventional way of doing things. So to that extent, you're right. How we count, how we quantify, is a conventional matter. But the fact that there are quantities to be counted is a different matter. Right. The fact that we can count is not what creates the quantities.
No. Right. So what about 0 and infinity then? We couldn't do maths without them, but they are entirely, they are, you can look back in history and see when they were invented.
Yes, indeed. Well, 0 at least has a kind of, comprehensibility to it. Infinity, of course, doesn't, as you know. So we're now getting into the complexities of Cantorian set theory about what kinds of infinities there are. And we can think, again, you mentioned irrational numbers. Well, that's rather different from, say, the imaginary number, I, which, like infinity, is a device that helps to do certain kinds of mathematics. And, denumerable and non-denumerable infinities have doubled the size of a given infinity. So, for example, the infinity of integers is equal to the infinity of even integers, and all those things result in there being very, very useful and powerful fictions that you can appeal to in doing maths. 0, I think, is much more easily comprehensible because it's just the empty set. So we have a conception of that. Again, however, it is useful in mathematics. These things you're dead right about it. Given that they're useful, given that they're fictions, they are things that we have devised and developed. We, the human mind, has devised and developed to be able to deal very well with more complex quantities. Think, for example, of topology in mathematics. Very, very weird shapes and surfaces, and things like multiply complicated Mobius strips and what have you, and all that. It may very well be that these things are encountered in reality, in quantum physics, or in strange realms of space. But they may also just be mind games created by the mind, as you suggest, which we've extrapolated from things that we meet with and wish to describe.
Yes. Well, you have been fantastic, Anthony. I'm deeply indebted to having you on the show as a guest, but we are coming towards the end of our time now. I just want to ask you one question, which came out of your recent encounter with my friend Mark Darcy.
Oh yeah.
When you revealed that you asked your religious teacher, "How can you believe this?" But you didn't reveal his response. What did he say?
Okay. So yeah, it was quite an interesting response actually. He said, but because I have to just to enrich the story slightly. You know, when I said to him, I think I was about 13 or 14 at a boarding school. I'd asked the chaplain of the school to give me a reading list, and I'd gone through it very, carefully in the school holiday. I got back to school. I went to see him. I said to him, "I've read everything you've asked me to read, and I have to ask you, how can you believe it?" And because I said, I've heard this story lots of times before, because I was a big aficionado of Greek mythology. And the idea of a god making a mortal maiden pregnant who gives birth to an heroic character who, among other things, goes to the underworld and so on. Well, I mean, Zeus was always making mortal maidens pregnant, giving birth to heroes like Hercules, who did go to the underworld. So what's different about the Christian story? It's exactly the same story. And as we know, indeed, many of the biblical stories come from much, much, much more ancient sources. So I said to him, how can you believe it? And he said, every morning when I wake, I pray, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. And I said to him, so you don't even believe it either. And that was more or less the end of the conversation.
He needs to reiterate constantly, otherwise he falls into the trap of doubt, which believers always think is a sin. I like
you should get Dan Dennett on your show, John, because he's done a very interesting thing, which he and a colleague set up a private sort of website where priests and preachers and parsons, vicars and so on, who were full of doubt, who didn't really believe, but were staying in their jobs because they had nowhere else to go and no option.
Yeah. Well, there's a clergy project, isn't there?
That's the one. That's the one, the clergy project.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll tell Dan that you said I should get him on the show.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, before we part company, I want to do a little commercial, because next week's show is a bit of a diversion from our usual academics that we have when we can get them. We have next week John Steingard, who is the lead singer, or was the lead singer, of the Canadian Christian rock band, what are they called? Hawk Nelson. So he will be very interesting to talk to.
Is he still a Christian?
No, that's I should have mentioned that. He's become an atheist. Yeah. So that's why he's coming around shows like mine. So we've had plenty of comments, Anthony. We've had, I think, 35 people who are in various parts of the world. We often get viewers from Canada and South Africa is another place, because they're on the same time zone. And of course, this will become, and the minute I stop live streaming, this will become a podcast, and people will be able to continue to comment, and you will be able to join in too if you wish. So I'm going to play the outro. Thank you very much.
Real pleasure, John. Thank you very much.
Enjoy your wine.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.